Hi everybody, welcome back to our last class for English 229, and this is for our class for Wednesday the 16th of December. We were talking a little bit about The Exorcist, and I wanted to read one of the quotes that I think is probably one of the most powerful statements of the text itself. And it's at the ending of the text when Marin and Karras are talking about the purpose of possession, and Marin confides to Karras that at one time, long ago, I despaired of ever loving my neighbor. Certain people repelled me. How could I love them, I thought. It tormented me. Damien, it led me to despair of myself. And from that, very soon, to despair of my God. My faith was shattered. Karras looked up at Marin with interest. And what happened, he asked. Well, at last I realized that God would never ask of me that which I know to be psychologically impossible. That the love which he asked was in my will and not meant to be felt as an emotion at all. Not at all. He was asking that I act with love, that I do unto others, and that I should do it unto those who repulsed me and repelled me. And that, I believe, was a greater act of love than any other. He shook his head. I know that all must seem very obvious, Damien, I know that. But at the time, I could not see it. Strange blindness. How many husbands and wives, he uttered sadly, must believe they've fallen out of love, because their hearts no longer race at the sight of their beloveds. Ah, dear God. He shook his head and then nodded. There it lies, I think, Damien. Possession, not in wars, as some tend to believe, not so much, and very seldom in extraordinary interventions such as here, this girl, this poor child. No, I see it most often in the little things, Damien, in the senseless, petty spites, the misunderstandings, the cruel and cutting words that leap unbidden to the tongue between friends, between lovers. Enough of these, Marin whispered, and we have no need of Satan to manage our wars. These we manage for ourselves. And if we think about the ending of the book, when finally Father Karras is lying dying at the ending of the staircase, and the passerbys basically are indifferent and ignore him, dismiss him as a drunk and don't want to get involved. I think this is a good illustration about how, yes, evil has been vanquished in Regan's bedroom, but that's not to say that the small evils of the daily world have been vanquished. And I think that ultimately is Blatty's lesson to us. That said, certainly the text has oftentimes been read as a commentary on the youth culture of the 1960s and the 1970s, and the fear, there really is no other way of putting it, that the populace had about a youth culture that seemed incredibly rebellious and uncontrollable. Though, of course, there are other ways of reading this text as well, and I had suggested that the title is Clue, that we should focus on the exorcists themselves rather than on the possessed girl, though as many of you said so eloquently in the attendance question, it's very difficult not to focus on the possessed girl because she violates so many of our social taboos. So when we talk about, or when Stephen King talks about the gross out, I can't think of a better example than something like Regan MacNeil in The Exorcist. And where we are today is we have some short stories by Stephen King. If you'll remember, we began the semester with Stephen King when we were reading some of his text, Danse Macabre, and he was talking a little bit about his theories about what Gothic is. And in the text Night Shift, which happens to be a compilation of some of his shorter stories, there's a foreword where he talks a little bit again about his theories about horror and Gothic, talking about that the horror writer is maligned, perhaps because the horror writer brings what he calls bad news. Basically, it's about death and the reality that we all have to face death on one level or another, and that the texts that horror writers write serve as a kind of filter between our conscious and unconscious mind, and that the best horror texts, the best Gothic texts, the best supernatural texts are those which are allegorical. In other words, they aren't necessarily just literal, but they're metaphoric and symbolic as well. And the two stories that I selected I'm not having you write a journal on because I thought that this would just be closure for the class itself. But if you wanted to earn just a little bit of extra credit, you could add an additional journal to the class and write a journal about Jerusalem's Lot and One for the Road, Stephen King's 2 short stories. But your last journal would be on The Exorcist, and all of your outstanding assignments are due on Monday. And that would be Monday, December 21st, 8 a.m. And that is also the time in which I will be posting your final exam, and it will be an essay exam, and you will have choice within that exam. It's open book, open notes, so you can reference any materials that you like. You've got 24 hours to take that particular examination, so it will be due on Tuesday, December 22nd at 8 a.m. to my email. And if we were taking this exam in class, you would have approximately 2 hours to take this exam. And if you wanted an additional hour, I would have given it to you. So you should estimate something like 2 to 3 hours to take this exam maximum. This is also when paper number 2 would be due as well, though many of you have already been submitting in paper number 2, and I thank you for that. And in terms of Jerusalem's Lot, those of you who have been reading carefully this semester will see lots of references to the Gothic masters. That's part of the fun of being able to read Jerusalem's Lot. And also Stephen King is very well versed in the history of Gothic literature. So I've listed in the notes below just some of the things that he does. If you don't know, Jerusalem's Lot, that short story, was the basis for a very famous novel that was eventually turned into a film by Stephen King entitled Salem's Lot, his modern day adaptation of the vampire tale. And definitely Jerusalem's Lot is an homage to Dracula, but also to other Gothic texts. And it begins with an epistolary format with journals and letters. And we know that Dracula and other Gothic texts do that as well. It's set in the 1800s, which again would have been the heyday for Gothic literature. We learn about this isolated bad home with a dark history that in some ways might be reminiscent of a Hill House that has a mysterious cellar. Note how often Lovecraft talks about things like that. And these strange noises that seems to be rats that are in the walls. In fact, Lovecraft wrote a short story called Rats in the Walls. The house comes with all kinds of historical lore, and we've talked about how many of the Gothic texts have sort of laid out historical lore for us that have become part of our popular culture. There's a reference to Anne Radcliffe, and she was one of the early Gothic writers at the time. There are church desecrations that might be reminiscent of what we discussed in The Exorcist. There's a reference to Nosferatu, which we would have definitely talked about in Dracula. There's references to incest and interbreeding, and that's very Lovecraftian, as well as references to whippoorwills, again, more Lovecraft, and this hereditary evil that basically is brought into present day. And One for the Road is the present day story of the Lot, Jerusalem's Lot. And Stephen King puts his own twist onto things in his modern day telling of that story. He oftentimes sets his stories in Maine or at least New England. He oftentimes talks about large snowstorms or nor'easters being basically a kind of monster in and of themselves. If you're familiar with The Shining, then you'll be familiar with that technique. He oftentimes talks about bars and alcohol, and he himself admits that he had a drinking problem. And once again, in One for the Road, we're set in a bar in the middle of a nor'easter in Jerusalem's Lot, where city folk come, and it turns out they've made the mistake by taking a wrong turn and having a breakdown in Jerusalem's Lot, and they need to be saved, or they hope they can be saved. One of their party comes to the bar and asks for help. And, well, you'll have to read the story to see how it turns out. So both of these stories are very much steeped in the Gothic tradition. So if we think about a modern day horror writer like Stephen King, certainly he's achieved fame and name recognition in the way that perhaps many other authors haven't. And that said, it's part because of his ability to storytell, his reference to contemporary times, and one of the things that Stephen King likes to oftentimes do is make references to elements that are very familiar to our society. So he will oftentimes talk about advertising and name brands. Again, something that can ground us in our present day time. So we're not necessarily in a Gothic castle. We might be in the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, for instance. But there will be lots of references to the former Gothic masters. And in fact, talking about The Shining and the Overlook Hotel, there's a section there where they say, unmask, unmask, and that's a direct reference to Edgar Allan Poe and The Mask of the Red Death. So as you are reading contemporary Gothic writers and horror writers, I hope you'll be able to identify some of the ways that they've been influenced by the tradition. For today's attendance question, it's actually a question I asked in the past, and some of you have already responded to it via my email. So if you've already responded to it, you do not have an attendance question today. Congratulations. But if you haven't responded to it, my attendance question, and please send the response to my email, is English 101 at GCC is designed to prepare students for college-level reading, writing, and research challenges across all disciplines at the college. What skills, knowledge, and or resources were you introduced to, or did you practice in English 101, which is the English Composition 1 class at GCC, that you find to be particularly useful now? And are there areas you wish had been covered in more depth in your English 101 class? And again, your final examination will be posted by Monday at 8 a.m. All outstanding assignments are due by that particular point in time. And I just wanted to end by thanking all of you. This has been nothing short of an extraordinary semester for a whole host of reasons. And I am nothing short of awed by your ambition and your focus and your ability to take a course in the middle of a global pandemic with all kinds of social and political challenges occurring around you. So thank you very much for sticking with the semester. And as I like to say, I'm well. I hope you're well. And I will be posting the exam on Monday. Take care. Bye-bye.